Join me as I dive into the challenge of exploring how God creates a whole new humanity through Jesus. I'm talking about Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16, and it reads, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility." Now, this passage is part of Paul's explanation of how Christ has reconciled Jews and Gentiles, breaking down the barriers that once separated them. It follows his reminder of the Gentiles' former alienation from God and precedes his description of their new status as fellow citizens with God. See, this passage addresses the reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles through Christ's work on the cross. Paul uses the metaphor of a dividing wall to illustrate the separation that existed between these groups. The law, with its commands and regulations, had served as a barrier, but Christ's sacrifice abolished this division. Okay, now that we know all that, let's get into the devotional. So, in a world marked by division and hostility, the message of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16 resonates with profound hope. Christ's work on the cross didn't just reconcile us to God, it also tore down the walls that separate us from one another. The truth challenges us to consider, what are the dividing walls in our own lives and in our communities? Just as the Berlin Wall once stood as a stark symbol of division, only to be joyfully dismantled, Christ has demolished the barriers that keep us apart. But unlike physical walls, the barriers in our hearts often require our active participation to truly come down. This passage calls us to embrace the unity that Christ has made possible. It invites us to see others not through the lens of our differences, but through the reality of our shared reconciliation to Christ. In doing so, we participate in the new humanity that Christ has created, a humanity marked by peace, unity, and reconciliation. As we reflect on this truth, may we be inspired to be agents of reconciliation in our own spheres of influence, tearing down walls of hostility and building bridges of understanding and love. With all that being said, what dividing walls do you see in your own life or your community that Christ's reconciling work challenges you to address? Thanks a lot for listening. If you like this content, please like, share, follow. God bless you, and keep praising his holy name. Join me as I delve into the emotional and poignant cry of David in the wilderness, a desperate plea to God for comfort, guidance, and salvation. In this quick Bible study and devotional, we'll explore the psalmist's heartfelt words, examining the context and emotions behind his desperate cry. Our uncovering the timeless lessons and inspiration that can be applied to our own lives. If you struggle with feelings of loneliness, despair, or uncertainty, this video is for you. So Psalm 63 is a striking expression of longing for God. It was written during a time of exile, and it begins in verse 1 with an intense declaration of spiritual thirst. And it reads, "O God, you are my God. Honestly, I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." David's words set the tone for the entire psalm, painting a vivid picture of his deep spiritual need. The metaphor of a physical thirst in a barren wilderness speaks to the soul's yearning for connection with God, a longing that surpasses any earthly desire. The repetition of "you" emphasizes the intimate, personal nature of David's relationship with God. The Hebrew word for seek conveys an early, diligent pursuit, suggesting that seeking God is David's foremost priority. This opening verse resonates deeply, reminding us of in times of when our own lives have felt like deserts, parched, empty, and in desperate need of refreshment. So David's experience in the wilderness, fleeing from King Saul and living in caves, serves as a backdrop for this cry. He was physically isolated and emotionally burdened, yet his greatest longing was not for safety or comfort, but for God's presence. In verse 2, David recalls past experiences of worship in the sanctuary, and it reads, "So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory." These memories of God's revealed majesty fuel his current desire for communion. Even in the wilderness, David's heart clings to the beauty of worship, reminding us of the sustaining power of remembering God's past faithfulness during our own trials. David's ability to find satisfaction in God despite his circumstances is evident in verses 5 and 6. "My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night." See, here David compares his soul's satisfaction in God to the enrichment of a lavish feast. His meditations on God and his character and steadfast love transform his perspective even in exile. It is a powerful reminder that focusing on God can bring deep peace and joy, even when life feels uncertain or bleak. The psalmist culminates in verse 11, a statement of confidence in God's protection and justice. And it reads, "But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exalt, for the mouths of liars will be stopped." The progression for the longing to satisfaction to confidence illustrates the transformative power of trust and worship. David's despair gives way to hope, and his fears are replaced with assurance in God's sovereignty and faithfulness. I think David's wilderness experience is profoundly relatable. Imagine living in a constant fear, hiding from your enemies, and living utterly alone. Yet in the midst of such trials, David poured out his heart to God, composing prayers and songs that would later become the psalms we cherish today. These psalms, such as Psalm 13, were his laments. "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever?" reveal the raw honesty of his relationship with God. David's willingness to cry out to God in desperation teaches us that expressing our pain and seeking divine comfort is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to our trust in God. Reflecting on David's story, we see a transformational turning point when he receives assurance from God. This encounter reaffirms his faith and shifts his perspective. Similarly, our own wilderness moments often lead to profound spiritual growth. When we surrender our struggles to God, we open ourselves to his comfort, guidance, and redemption. Psalm 63 challenges us to prioritize our relationship with God, recognizing that he alone can satisfy our deepest needs. So in a world that often leaves us feeling parched and empty, this psalm reminds us of the deep satisfaction found in him. Worship and meditation on God's character can transform our outlook, enabling us to find joy and hope even in the midst of hardship. Let's take a moment to reflect. First, in what areas of your life do you currently experience a thirst for God? And second, how might you more earnestly seek him, even in difficult circumstances? David's journey teaches us that crying out to God is an act of faith. It's a declaration that we trust him to hear us, to comfort us, and to lead us through the wilderness. As we meditate on Psalm 63, may we cultivate the same earnest seeking, the same heartfelt longing for God's presence that David exemplifies. And in doing so, may we discover the unshakable hope and solace that can only be found in him. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the wilderness with David. David. If this message resonated with you, please share your thoughts or personal experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our next video, where we continue to explore biblical stories and hope and redemption. Together, let's seek God and find the deep, abiding satisfaction that only He can provide. God bless you, and keep praising His holy name. Hello again. Have you ever stood in the middle of a storm, the wind howling, the rain pounding, and wondered, how much longer can I hold on? Well, life often feels like that, doesn't it? A relentless storm that threatens to sweep us away. But here's a question to consider. What's your shelter? What keeps you grounded when the winds of injustice and trials rage against you? Today, I want to talk about finding that shelter, and we're turning to a powerful piece of scripture, Psalm 57, to guide us. This psalm, attributed to King David, is raw, it's vivid, and it's unflinchingly honest. It's an imprecatory or condemnation psalm, which means it doesn't shy away from expressing frustration, anger, and righteous indignation against evil. It was likely written during a time when David himself was being hunted down by King Saul, and he was a man driven by jealousy and a thirst for power. So Psalm 57 is more than a historical artifact or a poetic rant against the corrupt leaders. It's a cry for divine justice in a world where wrong often seems to prevail. David paints a picture of wicked rulers as venomous snakes and declares their power, no matter how intimidating, will crumble under God's judgment. It's a reminder that evil's triumph is temporary. So, what does this ancient psalm mean for us today? We may not be running for our lives like David, but we're all facing storms. Maybe it's the storm of injustice, seeing corruption prevail, while good people suffer. And maybe it's the storm of personal struggles, the loss of a loved one, a job that slipped through your fingers, or even painful betrayal. Whatever your storm is, Psalm 57 reminds us of a profound truth. God is our ultimate shelter. When David penned these words, he wasn't just venting. He was affirming his faith in God's justice, trusting that the wicked would be judged and the righteous vindicated. He was looking beyond the immediate storm to the calm that only God can bring. But let's be honest, trusting in divine judgment isn't always easy. When we see evil prospering and injustice growing roots, it's tempting to just lose hope. The vivid imagery of Psalm 57, snakes with broken fangs and snails melting away, it's God's way of telling us that no matter how powerful evil appears, it will ultimately prove futile. The psalm challenges us to do two things: trust in God's judgment and align ourselves with His righteousness. We're not called to passively wait for the storms to pass. As followers of Christ, we're called to work for justice in this world while trusting God with the ultimate results. Every small act of kindness, every stand against corruption, every prayer for the oppressed contributes to God's larger plan and sets the world right. Let me share a personal story. There was a time when I felt like I was drowning in a sea of challenges. One problem came after another, and I started to lose my footing. But during that particularly difficult night, I remember Psalm 57, and I reflected on how David poured out his heart to God, trusting Him to deal with the wicked. That night I realized something. My shelter wasn't in my ability to solve my problems or fight my injustice alone. My shelter was in God's promises. So I turned to God, I prayed, I let go of my need to control the storm, and I trusted. And you know what? The storm didn't vanish immediately, but my perspective shifted. I found peace in the chaos because I knew God was in control. Psalm 57 is a call to faith, but it's also a call to action. It reminds us that evil won't have the final word. God will. And that's the shelter we all need. The assurance that our struggles, our storms are not the end of the story. So let me ask you again, What's your shelter in a storm? Is it your faith, your family, or your community? Whatever it is, lean into it, nurture it, and trust that no matter how fierce the storm, God is your refuge. Let's take inspiration from Psalm 57 and work together to build a world that reflects His judgment, trusting that He will set all things right in the end. Thank you for joining me today. Share your stories of resilience, your struggles, your triumphs. Hey, together we can remind one another that no storm is greater than God's shelter. God bless you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep praising His holy name.